All right. So today I'm going to talk about what I am calling origamish design, and that is about how I use origami as a tool, aesthetic, or inspiration in other areas of design. I'm a fashion designer in New York, largely because of origami, which I will talk about. Now, what we are looking at here is Katy Perry singing on top of a large animatronic lion at the halftime show of the 2015 Super Bowl. For those of you who are European, the Super Bowl is the... Sorry, I wrote a joke and now I'm forgetting it. Yes, the Super Bowl halftime show is the most American part of the extremely American World Championship game of the most American sport of football. So now when Katy Perry performed on this giant lion thing, I was not watching the game, but suddenly I started getting a ton of texts from friends, cousins, relatives, whoever, saying, "Look, Adrienne, Katy Perry is on top of an origami lion." And now, I mean, part of me wanted to say, well, that's not origami. If anything, it's like paper craft. But there is no prize for nitpicking, so I just thanked them. But it wasn't for nothing that I was suddenly getting all these texts. There was a reason that all of these people decided that this was origami, or that something about it felt like origami. Next slide. Oh no, come back. Okay. All right. So what feels like origami? I'm defining origamish as anything that reminds you of some aspect of origami. Maybe more literally, it could be anything that is folded, creased, pleated. It could be something papery, paper art, paper craft, kirigami. It also could be mathy, linear, angular, geometric, faceted, polyhedral, crease patterning, anything that when you look at it, it feels like something like origami. Even from a certain perspective, a quesadilla might feel like origami.
A what?
A quesadilla. A tortilla folded in half with cheese? Yes. But before I tell you about some of my origamish projects, I'll first tell you about how origami directly led to me becoming a fashion designer. So I've pretty much always done origami since I was about 5 or 6. Oh, no, another joke. My mom did some origami when she was pregnant with me, so I like to tell people I've been doing it since before I was born. But in college, I was mostly on a serious academic track, but to do it for my undergrad honors degree, I could do a senior thesis on whatever I wanted, so long as I had departmental approval and some professor to work with. So I went to them and I told them I wanted to do origami, and they sent me off to the math department. And I spoke to a professor there, and he said, well, why don't you do a hyperbolic surface? And I said, okay, cool, what is that? And I spent an entire semester making myself nuts trying to figure this out, and this particular kind of geometry with a negative curvature, that's a Osby talk, we don't talk about it. But it's really difficult because there's a lot of strain on the model. So I made myself really nuts doing this. And then about 6 months after I graduated, I realized that Tom Hull's fizz units, which I was very familiar with, I did a lot of buckyballs, I want to say in middle school. But I realized those fizz units could have very easily solved this problem and saved me a lot of lost sleep that whole semester. So I got some positive attention about these hyperbolic surfaces at my very first convention, which was Vancouver 2007 Peacock. Somebody wanted to take some pictures of them. And then, I don't even know how these people found me, but this book, Unfolded, asked me for some crazy high-res photos. And I didn't really think much about it, but when it came out, it had Frank Gehry, it had Issey Miyake. Oh, it's too small to read here. It's paper in design, art, architecture, and industry, It had Robert Lang in it. And I don't even know how they found me, but they did. And at that point, I was barely on the internet. So the lesson there is sometimes, what is the lesson? Oh yes, you always stand out by using fun colors. Especially if you're doing modulars and you can come up with nice patterns. I was always into fashion and making my own clothes, but I hadn't really thought about the explicit connection between origami and fashion design until I talked to Tomohiro Tachi at my first OUSA convention. He was working with Eric Demain at MIT at the time, so he was in Boston. He came to the convention. And everything he says sounds really wise and really smart. He looks like he's really thinking about it. So no matter what he's talking about it, you always feel enlightened. And he said he actually got excited when I told him I was interested in fashion design. And he said, yeah, it's one of the most direct applications of origami. You're basically taking a flat surface, whether it's fabric or paper, and transforming it into a different shape, probably a 3D object. Oh, I missed a paragraph. And part of why I'm mentioning all of this is that the positive responses I was getting of this origami actually gave me the confidence to think maybe I could do something artistic, or that I could work as a designer. Well, that is unfortunate. It wasn't something I'd really considered as being possible in my life before, but that's what led me to thinking about it, and later having that conversation with Tomohiro. So I'm in Texas, where I've been living all my life, and I went off to FIT in New York to do the accessories design program, which is basically all leather goods, shoes, bags, belts, etc. And something I realized pretty early on at school is that origami directly influences how I think about design. When I'm designing something in my head, I am seeing lines and shapes. So when I'm drawing something in my head, there are lines and shapes. And that is not necessarily how other people in my program thought about design. Some were really into thinking, how can I use this material, or how can I use this detail, or I want to make this kind of style. But my brain was seeing lines and shapes. This first bag here, we had to do a tote project. They told us to do something with not more than maybe 4 or 5 pattern pieces. So I did 14, because I really wanted those lines. The second one is a hexagonal anti-prism purse, and the whole class was sitting there drawing things with rulers and doing measurements, and of course I was folding because I needed a perfect hexagon, and whatever else, and they found that amusing. I also, something I had encountered with origami is I often became frustrated when I made something, because I made all these beautiful models, and then they sat in boxes, and I forgot about them, and most of them eventually got thrown away. So I was really excited when I was going to school that I could take this love of origami and apply it to something else that would be more lasting and usable. Here are some more literal applications of origami. I started tessellating leather. And this also, you're seeing here origami kind of applying more directly to what I was doing in school. I didn't think about it too seriously at the time, but these early projects here later got me into a very serious exploration of doing tessellations in fabric. And you can't fold, well, the first one there is a trial. It's pigskin because that was cheap material. You can't fold that like you would with paper. It doesn't want to be pre-creased, it doesn't want to hold a shape, it doesn't want to cooperate. You have to use a lot of force. So I had to think about, well, what is the end product and how could I possibly get there? And what are the properties of this material and how are they affecting the final design? So we talk about using the best paper for certain kinds of models, and I know we're actually having a panel on that after this. But how would you do justice towards a model if you had to use a different kind of paper or a different material altogether? So that's something to consider when you're designing something, is not taking the paper for granted. So after I graduated from FIT, I was working professionally as a shoe designer. and running a lot to China to work with factories, and I started sourcing weird materials. Around that time, I also got access to a laser cutter, so I got really into cutting fun things with weird materials and crease patterns. So I never made gloves before I made this glove, but something I realized during fashion school was that many years of origami had given me a really good understanding of pattern making and visualization for figuring out what a pattern would need to look like to make a 3D object. It's pretty easy for me to look at a complex, flat sewing pattern and immediately see what that finished garment would look like. And that is not something, sorry, I can't talk. I didn't realize that that was difficult for other people, because for me it seemed so easy, until I realized that other people in my class were struggling with their patterns. And I credit origami with making it really easy for me to often switch between 2D and 3D. So here's what's going on with this origami pattern here. So this is an old Fujimoto book, and the cover here, I worked with both the crease pattern and the final design and combined elements of both to make the laser cut in the middle there. I'll talk more about my process in a moment, but it's usually a lot of experimentation to see what works and what I like the look of. So my next source of origami inspiration was Issey Miyake's Baobab bag. These bags were very off. And it felt very origami-ish, but also really boring. And it did remind me of a water bomb base, which led to my next project, which I called the Sack. This is a laser cut bag made out of wood. It was one of my most ambitious projects. I used 1/16 laser cut wenge, which is an African wood. And it was entirely sewn and glued by hand. And the CP was based on a water bomb base with a few changes. I had to add some lines and take out a few others. So much so that after staring at it for a really long time, I think this was at the Japan OSMI, Tomohiro pointed at a part of it, and he said, "This is a non-folding vertex. It is irritating me." However, the non-foldable vertex means that the bag doesn't collapse or flatten entirely, which is an advantage for it holding its shape when it's displayed. And there we have the before and after. Now, when I'm working on a new project, I often can visualize how I want the final result to look, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to get there, if I can get there, or why I can't get there. So this involved a lot of material tests to determine, what glue, what method of gluing, how I was going to attach the pieces, how much space I needed between the pieces, how to do this as cleanly as possible. And I couldn't sew it inside out like you would when you would normally make a bag. So I had to do it blindly, pretty much by touch, with just figuring out what was on the inside and trying to sew those bits together. Occasionally using my cell phone between my teeth as a flashlight while I was sewing. I chose wenge, which is kind of wood, because I wanted a hard wood that wouldn't scratch or nick too easily. I wanted some variation in the color and green, but not too much, that it would distract from the crease pattern. And of course, wenge ended up being one of the most expensive woods, but I took that to mean that I probably have good taste. And when one of the pieces got glue on the front, I had to replace it, and I couldn't find anything that was a good match for the pattern and the grain. So then I basically took all the pieces and mixed up all the patterns and all the grains And that ended up being one of my favorite elements of the bag that I hadn't really planned for. Also, the lesson here is when you're working on something new and you're really obsessed and you get frustrated, sometimes it's best to just give yourself some time, sleep on it, and after a little break, sometimes the solution is really, really obvious. In this case for me, I couldn't think of what to name this thing, and the next day I realized that the Issey Miyake Bao Bao, the original one, literally means bag bag. So that I obviously should call this Sack Sack, both as a tribute to the Issey Miyake Bao Bao, and because Sack is my last name. Incidentally, I don't know, is she here? Well, this comment is for, I think Alessandra has a version of this, maybe, the iridescent one. A lot of the knockoffs in the last couple of years have suddenly become a lot more interesting because China has been cutting down on counterfeits, and by changing the pattern, they can claim that it's not an exact copy. My work at the time was super demanding, and I didn't have really much time at all to make another Sack Sack. So I got into jewelry because the actual construction and production is much faster. I'd like to tell you something about my process with these crease patterns and some of the things that I consider. I take certain liberties with the crease patterns for aesthetic reasons, and this is where design experience is helpful. And some things I have to do for function. CPs often have very dense areas and very sparse areas, and the pattern is more visually interesting when it's dense, but if it's too dense, then whole parts of it are going to melt or burn if it's being laser cut. So I have to work around that. And often I'll try a bunch of different versions till I decide I like something. So that necklace was based on a triangular rose box by Christine Edison. She's a good friend of mine. And so here on the left, I started with the original, and I tiled it. And often I'll tile it both. I'll try reflective symmetry, I'll try radial symmetry, to see what I like the look of. And I felt like this one on the left, the original, was too sparse. So I repeated one of the elements in the corners of the triangle, and I got what was on the right there. And I thought that was too repetitive, and I wasn't that into it. And then I tried what I did on the left here, and I decided that's what I liked. And that's how I made the necklace. And something you might not realize about this is that on first glance it might look symmetrical, but it's actually not. Asymmetry is something that I like to play with because I think it's a little more interesting to look at. And I don't know if you can see it too well in this light, but I have a triangle around the unit there that I tiled. And even though I made this necklace, I own this necklace, I've had it for a long time, I still have to look at it every time I wear it for a really long time just to find that triangle unit. This next necklace was based on the same pattern as I used for the previous one, but I was getting into 3D printing. And one of my guiding principles in all of these projects is that someone should be able to appreciate them as jewelry or as design, regardless of whether they know anything about origami. So the people in this room might appreciate this, that it's based on a crease pattern, and you know, if you know how to follow this, you can make all these things. But somebody who might be on my Etsy shop or a relative of mine, I want them to be able to like that necklace, whether or not they know where it comes from. There's a lot of shitty design out there, in my opinion, that gets mileage just because people think that origami or 3D printing or laser cutting is really cool. But I think that the actual product is terrible. So I try to make sure that it's cool even beyond being just that it's 3D printed or that it is origami. On the other hand, some of the shitty design out there sells really well, so I might still have more to learn. Here's a pattern, a ring that I did with the same pattern as the glove. I added some dimensionality, I am struggling with words, by beveling it. But then I got a comment from Brian Chan on my Facebook that this wasn't proper 3D because I was really just extruding something 2D. Now, I think only Brian Chan is allowed to make fun of my weak 3D printing because he literally designs and builds 3D printers from scratch. And his 3D models are just as intricate and complex as his origami. So much so that Brian is a legend at the company that does my 3D printing. And one of their staff members got really excited when they found out that I know him. So Brian wanted me to make something more 3D. And I had wanted to make these earrings for a long time, but I didn't have the 3D modeling skills. The original shape is based on this step of the traditional crane, which I tiled radially, and I played around with the width and the number of repetitions. So it ended up looking like a fish face. And Brian helped me with this, but he made me do the whole thing myself, which took a really long time and was really frustrating. So the lesson here is if you really want to do something and you don't have the skills, get help. Speaking of working with others, collaborating with somebody who has different but overlapping skills for me was the best. So my friend Sam Ida, who's a New York-based pop-up book artist, he's very prolific. He does pop-up books not for little kids, but where each page does like 50 different amazing things. His publisher asked him to do a book for children of cut and fold paper hats, and he asked me to collaborate. Now, I think designing something simple is really, really, really hard. A lot of designers have a tendency to hide behind complexity. And while I do think that complexity certainly has its place, and I'll be the first to tell you that Eric Rosell is my favorite origami artist ever, and he was certainly very complex with his origami. I also think sometimes there's a tendency in origami to assume that complexity is better, or people have a need to show off their technical skills, or they don't know how to edit, and the design becomes far more complicated than it needs to be. I feel that every part and every step of a model should be necessary and important. There's something about good design that feels to me really clever and intuitive, like each part of it was always meant to be that way. I get this feeling when I look at models by Yoshizawa or Beth Johnson, where every part just seems like it was always like that. And they were both very good designers. Anyways, this book was for kids, so every element had to be understandable and basic. That is hard. If you want a fun challenge this weekend, I challenge you to come up with a good model that's maybe 10 steps or less, or design a basic flower. If you're not used to doing this, or you're not Paula Versnick, it is really, really hard to make simple models. Here's one of the hats in the book that was inspired by one of the units from Elon Garby's Cube series that he does. Now, I was happy with the overall design of the hat, but very unhappy with the lock. It had a really complex, inelegant lock that would have been twice the number of steps, and it was really not suitable for a kid's book of paper hats. And I was explaining this to Sam in this last step, and he said, oh, just cut a little slit right there, and you can tuck that corner into itself. I would never have thought of just adding a small cut, and I thought that was absolutely brilliant. Some years later, the Science Museum of Oklahoma was doing a origami show, and they specifically asked me for paper hats. So I said, of course. And then I realized that all the stuff in my book I felt like was too simple for a museum show. So I had about 2 months to redesign everything, because I like to make my life difficult. And when I was doing this, I tried to come up with different hats that used a lot of different styles of geometric origami. So I used curved folding, corrugations, modulars, tessellations. And the lesson here was to be really, really clear about what somebody expects of you. I went to very great efforts to source all of the heads. I painted them, I applied texture to them so they didn't look like styrofoam. I made with each headpiece, I made a wig that went with the style. They were extremely difficult to ship because some of them pretty much couldn't be touched on any side. And when I told the museum about this, they were really happy because they were only expecting the hats. And I had done all this extra work for them. So when you are working on something, be super clear and precise about what it is that they want. Here's another photo from the exhibit. And I'm sure as many of you know, and I think Enrique discussed this in his lecture, people don't always appreciate the process behind the origami or what it is that you love about it. And that's fine, and the itself. But my favorite hat was this one here, which was entirely done from one piece of paper. So it was basically a long rectangle with some very carefully applied slits, so that the whole thing with the it's an offset tato and a flower topper was just one big piece of paper. But nobody knew that, or really cared. Here's another one that I liked. I combined a curved folded headpiece with some cutout spirals for the hair. And of course, something that I encountered over and over again as a fashion designer is that people always like something really stupid. So this one on the right, which to me is just a bunch of accordion folds, was by far everybody's favorite. In fact, in shoes, we had a rule, don't like any of the shoes too much because they'll be the first one that'll drop out of the collection. That leads me to share some, sorry, my throat's really dry, okay. That leads me to share some things I've learned as a commercial shoe designer. Always get feedback on your work. Remember that you are not your work, even if it feels really personal. Feedback about your work is not about you. When a product is in the market, nobody cares about you or what you want or what you think about it. They're just saying, oh, I like this shoe, or maybe I want to buy this piece of origami, and they may not necessarily know anything about you. I think that you can think more critically about your work if you're able to create a little bit of mental distance from it. Yes, it is. And I really only got used to that, having so much rejection in fashion all the time, where you design 200 things and they tell you everything's terrible or they only like 5 of them, that at some point all of that just washes over you and you have a complete detachment. So I think, Enrico, were you the one saying to fail often and then you hardly feel it?
That's part of the philosophy, yeah.
Yes, so try to be more OAS about what you're doing.
OAS is origami always succeed.
Next, I will talk about something extremely origamish, which is North American smocking. It's something I had vaguely known about for a long time, but I explored more in depth at 7 OSMI. And thus far, it is the most direct application of origamishness that I have found. So these are all examples of smocked fabric that I found on Pinterest, and they had nothing to do with origami. These patterns have existed in fabric for centuries and are structurally identical to many origami tessellations, but made with an entirely different process. I think that's the darndest thing, and that is an entirely different 45-minute lecture that you can ask me about another time. So here's a big pile of smocked fabric with some folded tessellations that I was working on while I was researching them. And of course, once I figured out how to make them with fabric, I had to make them with leather. That required a lot of trial and error because leather basically doesn't ever cooperate. And I had to attach a stabilizer to the back of it and sew through only part of the thickness of the leather, so we're talking about fractions of a millimeter, just to make sure that it wouldn't tear or puncture the top of the leather. And I did bring a few samples of this if anybody is curious about it or wants to see what a piece of smocked snakeskin feels like. Now, for years, people have asked me, why don't I make origami shoes? And I would give them this super long answer about how a lot of the properties that we need in origami are particularly badly suited for shoes. Something like having a lot of layers, needing a lot of flexibility in your shoes, taking a lot of wear and tear, having to support like however much your weight is, walking on them for however long. But with smocking, I finally had a good reason to do origami shoes. I don't right now have access to shoemaking equipment, so I made the leather bands and detached them to existing shoes, but I'm hoping at some point to do the whole thing from scratch. And now I'll talk about one other way that I've used origami to serve some kind of other purpose. My brother got married a few years ago, and I got this kind of vague phone call that they were thinking about doing something with origami for the wedding, and do I want to make some invitations? So I did. That was fun. I drew them and their cats, and they go rock climbing a lot, so there they are. And we attached magnets to the back and sent everybody a video on how to refold this. On the inside, they had all the information about the wedding. Of course, nearly everybody couldn't refold it, so I have a whole series of funny photos of partially folded invitations from people's fridges. And then my brother told me that everybody loved the origami invitations. They'd never seen something like that. And that now I was in charge of the wedding decorations. I was happy to do it, but after cutting, scoring, and folding about 70 invitations, I told my brother that he was buying me a scoring machine. And after looking at some origamish vases, like the one I had in the beginning of my lecture, I decided that I would make some vase covers that they could slide over existing vases or glass jars. And we went with mason jars because they're cheap and they're standard size. So I could design this and score it in New York to the exact proportions, and then bring everything to Chicago where my brother lives and assemble it right before the wedding. Here's another one of the vases from the wedding that was based on a Yoshimura pattern. And I ended up making a video tutorial about this for the website Apartment Therapy with some other decorative origami projects. I will mention this went viral, which was really weird for me. It's really exciting when every time you refresh, the number just leaps and leaps and leaps. And then it was really anticlimactic because at some point it tapered off and that was it. And I have a neighbor who was tinkering with stained glass. So we made an origamish lamp that came from the origami vase covers that came from the origamish vases. So there we've really come full circle with origamishing. The moral of this lecture, I hope you'll take in here, is that you might find a lot of inspiration by looking in other fields around you. Consider other materials and techniques, be curious, cross-pollination or contamination of other ideas is a great way to evolve your art, and that's why I came here to CSC, to see all of you and be contaminated by you. And thank you for coming to my lecture or making sure to get a good seat for Roberts. Do y'all have any questions?
What is that you're working right now?
What am I working right now? Not a lot. So the footwear whole fashion industry has been going super bankrupt in America, and I've actually all over the world. A lot of companies, I don't know, Forever 21, Macy's is a big department store. Everybody's going bankrupt right now, so they don't want to, no company wants to pay for senior designers, or if they do, they want you to work 4 jobs. So the fact that I'm not working right now is why I had the availability to come to CFC.
Okay.
It's a bit of a stressful situation, but I'm glad that I can come to these things.
It sounds like an origami artist.
Thank you. I'm glad that you consider me one. Yeah.
So why did you stop making jewelry?
I lost access to the laser cutter I was using, and I think, what was I doing? I started doing smocking.
Oh,
But I'm kind of, not that, I had enough of smocking. I mean, I still enjoy it, but some of you may follow her. Madonna Yoder went to my smocking lecture at OSME and went super nuts about smocking. So I've kind of been happy to hand the mantle to her. She makes many patterns a week. She literally wakes up at 5:30 in the morning and starts smocking and sending me photos. And often, well, she just moved, but often she'd be sending them from California at 5:30 a.m. or whatever, like before I woken up in New York. So I was into smocking. I enjoy doing these different things, but then I get interested in something else. I would like to do more 3D printing of the jewelry, but I'm really frustrated with the software I use. Rhino is really hard and annoying, and I can't always annoy Brian Chan. I'm actually thinking about taking some Rhino classes when I can, or studying more Rhino so that I can make jewelry that I want to make.
more questions? Thank you very much.
If there was a company that wasn't bankrupt, that would employ you,
yes,
and they would tell you that, okay, so we have plenty of tools, like laser cutters, like we have all the materials, wood, leather, anything, so what would you would be working on?
I would probably be making really weird sneakers. With weird materials, weird technologies. I say weird because I've spent, I don't know, a decade of my life staring at shoes, so I'm really bored with nearly all of them. And the ones that interest me are the ones that have a really surprising material or something weird going on. Not necessarily weird in a bad way, just stuff that, probably wouldn't sell in a normal market, because I have pretty specific tastes.
Okay, something you wouldn't be able to sell. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a problem with origami in general.
Yes, it is.
But I also just kind of like tinkering and messing around with materials and whatever kind of interests me at the moment. I love learning laser cutting, learning 3D printing, learning to make shoes. I get excited when something feels a little bit impossible and I have to figure out how to do it.
Welcome challenge then.
Yes. Along with the challenge of making a really good simple model.
Did you ever try to combine, I did this once, it was a Tessellation, which we did in Germany with Melina, and we found a store that sells fabric. You can like glue it on the paper and then we refolded it again. So we had both layers, but we had the perfect tessellation done. So it was first done with elephant hide.
I have seen people doing that, and I think that's great for them, but when I'm doing something with fabric or something with leather, I want it to have the properties of fabric or have the properties of leather. And when I've seen models like that, it feels like paper or fabric that is supposed to be paper. I can show you some of my fabric tessellations. They feel like fabric. They are fabric. They're just sewn together, so they behave like fabric. So I like the materials to do what they're supposed to do. Basically, I make my life a lot harder than it needs to be. Another origami problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. If we were going on time, you didn't get chocolate. Sorry about that.